we're going to start with nine markers, then 15s, then 25s. I'm just going to wing it in terms of timing and see how we do for time. I want to try and fit in at least one nine, 15, 25. And we'll see how we do. If we have time, I might go through consequences of inflation. That's a bit of a tricky topic, but I don't think we will have time. I should note as well, I've kind of been teaching these extra sessions so far with the sort of assumption you've been through the basics of ADAS. And from talking to a few of you outside of these lessons, it appears that might not be the case for all of you. So if you haven't got the impression already, if it hasn't been clear already, I'm saying it now. Get on board ADAS, learn the basics, make that a huge focus of your study, because we're not gonna have the time for me to explain all the like individual granular basics from the ground up. It's just not worth it for the class. So that's got to be on you, and the lessons are going to make a lot more sense if you've done that. It's not just going to be as well that we finish ADAS and then we don't talk about it and we move on to other stuff, because this is so fundamental to macro and how we think about how the economy works. We're going to be referencing back to it constantly, even when I move on to new topics. But okay, let's have a look. So our first nine marker, we've got an extract about development and growth in India. And our question says, with the help of a diagram, explain how export subsidies may help promote economic growth in India. So this I remember being quite a tricky one when my students got out of the exam and I spoke to them. They were like, "Oh, I really wasn't sure for this question. Do I do a subsidies diagram, as it clearly talks about subsidies? Do I do a ADS diagram because it talks about economic growth, and obviously I can use aggregate demand and supply to show changes in GDP and therefore economic growth." So the mark scheme makes it pretty clear that you can do either. There's actually three diagrams they would accept for this question. So, and one of them was subsidy. So even though it's a macro paper, you could do the micro subsidies diagram here and still get the marks as long as you explain yourself very well. But we're gonna focus on how aggregate demand and aggregate supply fits into this. So you could, to very, very briefly touch on how you might address it with a subsidy diagram, just for anyone wondering. Draw a subsidy diagram, supply shifts to the right, price goes down, output rises. And then you would just need to link economic growth in somehow, because you can't show that with the diagram. You might have to say something like, with the price of Indian products being cheaper due to the subsidy, which is shown by your diagram, they would sell more exports. And if they can sell more exports, then X value of aggregate demand rises and they would experience economic growth. So if you see what I mean, you sort of, in a way, you'd want to mention aggregate demand even if you don't draw the diagram. But okay, let's talk about the ADAS approaches here. So we could, for example, do a very, very straightforward aggregate demand, aggregate supply diagram. I don't even think I'm going to draw it for this one. Again, I'm just going to assume you guys are familiar. Aggregate demand shifts right, as I effectively just alluded to. Export subsidies are going to make your exports more competitive. Think about what a subsidy does. It just makes the good cheaper. Export subsidies therefore encourage people to buy exports. The X component of aggregate demand rises. Therefore, given the aggregate demand equation, AD as a whole rises. And then you can show on the diagram that GDP rises and economic growth happens. Now, the other way you could approach it is actually to shift aggregate supply, because subsidies affect the cost of production. So you could, for example, say, instead of going down the aggregate demand road, you could say something like, if the Indian government subsidizes exporting industries, this will effectively lower the cost of production across several industries in India. Because of the lowered cost of production, aggregate supply, short on aggregate supply, which effectively is based on cost of production in the economy, will then shift to the right, and again, GDP will increase, economic growth will be achieved. So, okay, thank you, Carmen, and telling me someone's in the waiting room because I'm not checking at the moment, especially as I might be making annotations. So, okay, so if what I've just said didn't make perfect sense to you like straight away, the likely issue is probably you don't have enough comfort with ADAS. So unless I draw it out, it's difficult for you maybe to visualize, wait, why does economic growth increase? My advice there would be when I post the videos, rewatch the videos, and then try and draw out what I'm saying by yourself and see if it checks out effectively. Hopefully it does check out. Hopefully I haven't made any amateurish mistakes. Okay, so let's see. Let's move on to the other 9 marker. Let's try and run through these fairly quickly. I'll talk a bit about AO2 for this one as well, I think. So, okay, what have we got here? With the help of a diagram, explain how improvements in productivity could cause deflation. So the key word that sort of makes me think I could use ADAS for this, much like in the first question, economic growth. I saw the word economic growth and I was like, oh, I could use an ADAS diagram because that shows economic growth on one of the axes. In the same way, deflation, I can show that with an ADAS diagram. If the price level falls on an ADAS diagram, that is deflation. That is the definition of deflation when the price level consistently falls. So we effectively we know straight away that ADAS is where we want to go for this. And then the question is just how does productivity relate to this idea of deflation? Well, if we're looking at deflation, price levels falling, it's either got to be a leftward shift in aggregate demand or a rightward shift in aggregate supply. And again, if that's not immediately obvious, it just suggests you haven't learned the content well enough to visualize it yet, which is fine. But that is your sign that you need to study a bit more until you can easily visualize these diagrams. So it's got to be either a leftward shift in AD or a rightward shift in aggregate supply to cause deflation. And we could do one of two here, and I will draw these out because I'm going to get a bit more complicated than I've gone so far. AD does not really make sense. There might be some sort of tangent we can make one step to another to get to AD. You can often do that with macro. But productivity is not something I associate immediately with aggregate demand. It's not something that easily fits in as a aggregate demand factor or something that affects consumption, investment, government spending. It's very much a supply side concept anyway. If you think back to micro, productivity is one of the factors that shifts aggregate supply. So we've got very, very similar approach in macro, to be honest. And there's two things we could do here. We could shift short run aggregate supply to the right, or we could shift long run aggregate supply to the right. And now this is something we have not covered in these classes yet, but it will come. One of my favorite things in macroeconomics. But notice that, and this is important for what I want to get across here. Let me just very badly label these. Sorry, S1. Oh, this is very time heavy investment. Okay, AD. So I'll try and do this as quickly as possible, but notice the essential effects on the macroeconomy are the same. Whichever of these applies, whether I'm talking about aggregate supply in the short run or long run, it doesn't seem to matter for the way I answer this question, or indeed similar questions, because if you look at the badly drawn equilibria here, the effect is the same. Price level falls, GDP rises. So whether we're using the short run model or the long run model of aggregate supply, doesn't seem to matter in terms of this question. It's asking us what would cause deflation. Both of these would cause deflation. If it was asking us how this links to economic growth, both of them would cause economic growth. So both of these are valid. Typically, productivity is associated more with the second one. So I would hope that students who understand the syllabus as it's laid out, as it's presented, will gravitate towards the second version with long run aggregate supply. I should fully label all the axes and curves and everything. I just haven't to save time. So I'd hope students go towards the second one, but the first one is valid, and there's a very simple reason for this, and it's the relationship between productivity and costs. Increases in productivity should always be associated with decrease in costs. So whilst in the second diagram, what I'm saying is, if you see the word productivity, you should associate that most with an LRAS shift. Okay, so most teachers, most textbooks, that's how they're going to get you to think about productivity. They're going to try and teach you, okay, productivity causes a shift in long run aggregate supply. Exactly why, I'll leave it for now. I'll give you a clue that the long run aggregate supply is a lot like the PPF curve. It effectively shows the potential output of the economy. But we'll go into more detail on that later. This one is associated with productivity, but anytime productivity increases, costs will also decrease. That's a sort of a mathematical truth with the way we quantify the concepts of cost and productivity. So if productivity increases, costs will decrease. On average, costs will decrease for businesses, and then we can justify this rightward shift of short run aggregate supply, as we discussed in the last 9 marker. Short run aggregate supply effectively just represents costs in the economy for businesses as a whole, or is based on costs for the economy. So if costs decrease because productivity increases, short run aggregate supply shifts to the right. This causes deflation. That's our analysis. That's our diagram. That's all we need for this question. So in closing, and as a little just extra note, what we should be squeezing in as well, as these are section A questions, is a bit of the extract. And I didn't do this for the last 9 marker to save time, because I want to try and get onto the 15s and 25s. But I will do it for this one because we've covered this second 9 marker a lot more quickly. So I've highlighted just the part of the extract the question guides us to. So we go down here, you can see it says extract E lines 9 to 10, improvements in productivity could actually lead to more deflation. And basically, with the help of a diagram, explain why. So typically, I wouldn't try and quote the exact part in the question. I don't think you get much AO2 credit for quoting the quote in the question. But normally, and I'm being a bit cheeky here because really I should be saying, like, read the whole thing so you get the context and you understand what's happening. But I'm being a bit cheeky and saying, like, normally you can get a couple of good quotes just from the sort of area around the line you're directed to. So we were directed to this. Why can't I highlight it? Oh no. Computers 2, Mat 0. Okay, we're directed to line 9 and 10. Just these last 2 improvements in productivity could actually lead to more deflation, but we could get some nice AO2 around that. Businesses could also spend more on investment, hiring staff or offering pay rises. We could use the offering pay rises to suggest a reason productivity might increase, or investment in new technology or better capital, for example. We could use this quote here to justify that. Again, this kind of investment or pay rise could lead to productivity gains after years of stagnation. And ideally, you want to get, like, definitely at least 1 quote or reference the data in your 9 marker. I would say at least 2 is for good marks for like an A grade. At least 2, and if you can get 3 or 4, you can use your own current affairs knowledge as well. I sent a oh, thank you, Raquel, but people gotta arrive on time. So I sent an email just before, not an email, put a post just before the lesson with some current affairs stuff you could read, so you can go through that kind of thing, or articles, and add your own knowledge in as well for AO2. But okay, so that pretty much wraps it up for the 9 marker. And what's interesting here is notice both 9 markers are just ADAS effectively. one on productivity, which, as I've said, should be very heavily associated with long run aggregate supply, but can also logically be associated with short run aggregate supply because of the relationship between productivity and costs. And then in our first one, we had something where you could use either aggregate demand, because rises in exports will increase the X component of aggregate demand, or short run aggregate supply, because export subsidies would reduce, again, the cost of production for businesses. So very, very heavy on ADAS, and it's not uncommon. It's more common than you might think that both the 9 markers are ADAS questions or very heavily feature ADAS in the mark scheme. So, okay, we'll have a quick look at this 25, just because I wanted to illustrate one of the things I was talking about last lesson, really, in that you might see essays now like this one where you look at it and given the topics you've covered so far, it might seem really, really challenging. Because this one asks us, evaluate the view that monetary policy is the most effective way of tackling deflation. You might say, I haven't done monetary policy. I haven't done deflation. I haven't done development. I haven't done the difference between developing and developed economies. So how on earth am I supposed to have any idea where to go with this question? But if I just told you monetary policy is interest rates, involves raising or lowering interest rates as a key policy, you can generate like half the essay, or at least half the analysis knowledge, just based on that, because we've got a very simple, if the central bank, who is in charge of monetary policy, again, that's the kind of thing you don't know, but again, most of the analysis we can do without that. If they lower the interest rate R, this will increase consumption and investment, which again are things we should know are basic components of AD. This is because if the rate of interest on saving and borrowing is lower, saving is less attractive, borrowing is more attractive. Businesses and consumers therefore save less, which means they will be spending more, i.e. increased consumption and investment. And they'll also be more incentivized to borrow, to spend money they don't have, because the interest rate is lower, so it's cheaper to borrow. So again, consumption and investment, spending in the form of borrowing by consumers and businesses will also rise. And then that's going to increase AD, and that is going to increase the price level, and that is going to tackle deflation, which is what this question is asking us about. Is monetary policy the most effective way of tackling deflation? Paragraph 1. Yes, it is a very effective way of tackling deflation and might even be considered the most effective, because simple diagram. And again, you can do a lot more than I'm doing here, but this is just to demonstrate how easy this is. Simple diagram. Yes, it is effective in tackling deflation because, as this diagram shows, the increase in consumption and investment will cause an increase in the price level, and that will help remove deflation, negative effects of deflation in the economy. Yes, this is very, very scruffy and doesn't have full labels, but roll with it, roll with it. Okay. So let's clear that all up then. Let's move ourselves on to the section B, essays and 15. I will pause for questions. Any questions, throw them in the chat. Or if there's anyone else still in the waiting room, probably let me know. So I do think this kind of exercise at the end of the day, it might be more of a listening one rather than a questioning one. But if there is anything, even if there's something you're not sure about, put it in the chat. You can still direct message me because I don't know how to use Zoom properly. So, you know, there's no shame, no fear present, I would hope. I mean, I might still judge you, but you don't seem to mind so much about that because I don't know why actually, but it's strange. If I were you, I would mind more about being judged by me than judged by your peers. They're a bunch of degenerates, let's be honest. But anyway, okay. So I'm assuming no questions. Let's have a look at the 15 marker. So there is only one I've highlighted here as being very ADAS relevant. That is question 13 here. I do think you could use ADAS for the others. It's just not as obvious, and it's actually probably more difficult than using for question 11, not something I'm going to spend ages looking at, but for question 11 in particular, it's probably more difficult to use ADAS than just the base topic here, which is the pattern of trade. But in this one, it should, for me, and I don't want to be cruel because I know sometimes I can sound a little cruel or dismissive, but this should be very obviously about ADAS. And if the student doesn't recognize that when they read this question, when they get to the final exam, either they are woefully underprepared or they have a big problem linking topics to questions. And it must be a big problem if you couldn't do it here, something you would need to work on massively because it should be, out of all questions, one of the most obvious. Government spending is literally, right, literally a component of AD. So we've got big clue here, government spending. That is directly a component of AD. It's in the equation. And taxation isn't in the AD equation, but it is one of the most basic, most obvious factors in things like consumption and investment. Think income taxes and corporation taxes. So income taxes, if they go up, will decrease consumption. Corporation taxes, same kind of logic. If they go up, will decrease investment. Firms will have less money, retained profits to spend. So again, I don't want to sound like patronizing or whatever, but for me, this was a very easy 50 marker, a very good choice, because it should be, compared to other questions, quite obvious that you need to talk about ADAS or what you need to talk about here. So economic activity is the only maybe tricky part that might put people off. And you get this kind of thing fairly often with AQA where they might put something in the question where there is not something that you've had clearly defined or explicitly, specifically defined for you before. That's often the case with economic activity. You've got to use a bit of common sense here. Hopefully, you'll recognize, most of you, that it's kind of common sense to think economic activity, actions, people taking actions, economic actions, buying, selling. So it should be fairly obvious what kind of stuff we read here. More buying, selling, more trade. That's going to, in a macro terms, mean things like more growth. GDP is definitely going to be affected by the amount of buying and selling, right? More buying / selling equals higher GDP. More stuff gets sold, more income is earned. Less economic activity, less buying and selling, less GDP. So it's maybe not obvious what they mean by economic activity, but they are expecting you to be able to sit down and use a sort of common sense, logical approach. I mean, hopefully, like if we were to list the things this probably doesn't mean, you're gonna end up with a much bigger list than the things it could mean, right? Which shows there is some logic to it, and there is a way to figure out what it means, even if it hasn't been specifically defined for you before. But okay, so we could do, let's talk about government spending first. That's the easy one. We could say increased G, where's my arrows? Here we go. Increased G leads, oh Jesus, no, sorry, my bad, technical issues. Increased G equals increased AD equals increased economic activity. Now, actually, the problem here is it's too easy. Let's say increased GDP, i.e., and that implies more economic activity. You can only get more GDP if there's, assuming constant price levels, more buying and selling. So let's say real GDP, actually, that factors out the price level. Oh God, what have I done? Just imagine, okay, this is real GDP. Yeah, that factors in the price level change. So basically, this is standing in for economic activity. And again, this is almost too easy. Our problem now is how are we going to string 15 marks out of this We need to add some AO2, so we might talk about what's a nice recent example, furlough scheme during COVID. Let's see if the government decides to launch any school concrete roof maintenance spending proposals before your exams. I think that'd be a funny one to talk about in the exam, especially if the roof of the exam hall caves in, God forbid, during the exam. But anyway, so any increase in government spending is AO2 would be quite nice and easy here. And similarly for the changes in taxation, let's think about what we could do there. So if we talk income tax, that's too easy. Decreased income tax equals increased consumption equals increased AD, more economic activity. You could do it the other way around here as well, because it doesn't say will increase, it just says might affect the level of. So it doesn't say you have to explain how it will increase or decrease. Oh, no, I should use this really for tax, personal income tax allowance. Well, you could use your own AO2, but this makes it really easy for the AO2 for taxes. Okay, so reduced income tax, increased consumption, increased AD, more economic activity, or we could do it around increased tax, decreased consumption, people have left to spend, decreased AD, less economic activity. We could do the same for corporation tax, which is basically just the same thing. Decreased corporation tax means more retained profits for firms. They'll have more money left over after the government takes their share of the profits. That means they could afford to invest more, and that means increased AD. So that's one way we could do it. You could also do increased investment could lead to improved capital or improved productivity, as we saw in one of the extracts above, which could lead to increased aggregate supply, short run or long run, which could lead to increased AD. Wait, did I just write that? No, that's AS. Sorry, which could lead to increased AS, short run or long run, which would lead to increased GDP. That's what I meant, i.e. increased economic activity. We could do similar stuff with taxation. Sorry, indirect taxes. So I've only talked about direct taxes here, income tax and corporation tax. We could also talk about, say, VAT, which is an indirect tax, which means it shifts supply, not demand. So the direct taxes taken straight from people's income or from their profits will shift aggregate demand. Indirect taxes, which are the type you learn about in micro, shift aggregate supply in macro. So VAT is going to lead to decreased cost of production. And as we've discussed at length, this is going to lead to increased short aggregate supply, and then increased GDP, and that's increased economic activity. So there's so much here. You could do 2 of these in a lot of detail, 3 or 4 of them in not as much detail. Throw in some AO2, define government spending, define taxation, give a common sense idea of what economic activity is. You are good to go. Devac says, what does COP stand for? Great question. Probably a lot of other people thinking that. Cost of production. Just couldn't be bothered to write out cost of production. So decrease VAT, decrease cost of production. So remember VAT, you probably won't have covered this explicitly at school yet. VAT, you might think that's a tax on you because you pay it when you go to the restaurant, but it's not. It's like the cigarette tax. Technically, the producer pays the tax, so it's a tax on supply. Effectively, it's a tax on the producer, and then they pass it on to you because their cost has gone up. So because restaurants are charged VAT, they pass that on to you in the form of higher prices. Because cigarette manufacturers are charged tobacco duties, they pass that on to you in the form of higher prices. So the consumer pays it indirectly, which is why it's called an indirect tax. But technically, it's not a tax on the consumer, it's a tax on the producer. They are responsible for paying it to the government. Like think about the way it works with restaurants. You're not paying the VAT to the government, right? You're paying it to the producer, and then they are paying it to the government. So really, it's a tax on them, they've just passed it on to you. This is often forgotten in macro, is that the direct taxes affect aggregate demand, broadly speaking. The indirect taxes, of which VAT is the most important in macro, affect aggregate supply, not aggregate demand. Many a multiple choice question to try and catch people out on that. But okay, any further questions? Very useful one from Devak there. Very good to seek clarity when it does not exist, which it didn't there. So any others, let me know. Otherwise, we'll start looking at some 25 markers. And let me clear all this mess. It's quite handy. This is what I do like about Zoom, right? I've worked out how to use, well, in a very basic level, worked a bit of how to use the pen and draw diagrams and stuff like this, but not yet how to change the chat settings. I'll get there. Watch out, guys. I will get there. Okay, let's have a look at these 25 cents. So we'll probably have time for one or two. Which two do I want to prioritize? We'll have a look at question 12 first, I think. This is another good example of something that maybe initially doesn't appear that you would even have a way in. Like, how are you supposed to answer this if you haven't done the current account, if you haven't done the balance of payments? There is even a topic, policies to reduce a deficit. This is a very straightforward question on that topic, which you guys will have not got anywhere near yet. So there's a specific topic coming up later, which is literally policies to reduce a deficit on the current account. And it's one of the easiest essays in macro as well. But you guys haven't done it yet. So how are we supposed to answer this question, right, without these key elements? So again, I will fill in one like very, very small detail, as we did with the monetary policy essay, and then we'll just use ADAS from there, basically. So I will tell you that a deficit on the current account, this is all we really need to know to get started here, just means the value of outflows. I'm not saying imports and exports here for a reason. The value of outflows is greater than inflows. So outflows includes imports, but is not just imports. And inflows includes exports, but is not just exports. There are other things on the current account other than exports and imports. Hopefully this is making like at least some sense as you guys have been over macro objectives and macro indicators, I believe. So you know roughly what the current account is. It's to do with trade, it's to do with exports and imports. Deficit means basically your country is spending more money. There's more money flowing out of your country to others than there's money coming in. It's not just exports and imports, but okay, so that's what that means. And whilst I have just said it's not just about exports and imports, we are going to tackle this almost exclusively focusing on exports and imports, because the other things in the current account are a bit trickier to talk about now. But there are other things there. That's my point, right? It's not just exports and imports. Okay, so if we want to reduce this deficit, so deficit is when the outflows are bigger than the inflows, that obviously means we need to increase the inflows or reduce the outflows, right? To change this deficit or to make this number smaller, we need to make the left-hand side smaller or the right-hand side bigger. So we can do that by, so the measures that might be taken could include, increasing exports or, there we go, that'll do, decreasing imports. Okay, and again, you might be thinking like, wait, how do I do this? I don't know what the policies are to increase exports or decrease imports yet. But again, if you've really mastered ADAS, you should know loads about how the government might achieve this, especially from the lesson where I explained how to link the ADAS diagram to the macro objectives. Let me give you an example. Very, very simple one, I hope. let's say, and I'll draw the diagram out as well. Let's say the government increases income tax. Okay, so someone put it in the chat, public if you can. Like there should be the confidence for this question. What is going to happen to aggregate demand if if they increase income tax? In the chat, please. Someone make my day. Put it public. Live or die by your interaction. Live or die by your engagement. Remember in an interview, right? If you in a job interview, group interview, which is so common these days, if you don't say anything because you don't want to look stupid, and there's someone else next to you who says something stupid, they're still going to pick that person because if you don't say anything, no one, like what you have to say is by default not recognized or not investigated or not corrected. Niati, thank you, my oh no, it's a direct message, not my hero. I was gonna say my hero. Again, I said it to the whole class anyway, so what does it matter? But my idea was people could save the chats afterwards, see the discussion. Anyway, maybe I'm living in fantasy. Anyway, okay, so increase income tax. AD will decrease, correct, well done, Niati, as consumption will decrease. And then this is going to, oh, I thought that was a straight line. So this is going to reduce GDP from Y1 to Y2. I'm going to draw the rest of it in just to save time. That's all I want to focus on here. So they increase income tax. That equals less consumption, just so you guys can follow along the whole chain. That equals less AD. That equals less income, less GDP, basically. So anybody else in the chat, again, hopefully public, make my day, be my hero. What is this going to do to imports if people have less income because GDP has decreased? The government's basically shrunk the size of the economy here on purpose. What will this do to imports? If you're not sure, think about it on a personal level. If you've got less income, what's going to happen to the amount of imports you buy? And I will happily wait as usual. Take my time, haven't had much coffee yet today, so. Here we go. Drew says decrease. Yes, Drew, could you? It's a direct message, not my hero. Wait, is it that you guys, I'm not going to get into it. I'm not going to get into it. So Drew says decrease. He is correct. As I'm going to answer the whole class, I would ask to explain why, but you probably that is a direct message. Then I'll have to explain it anyway. So I'm just going to cut out the middleman. So the reason why is if people have less money, they can't afford to buy as much stuff. That includes imports. Therefore, if you increase income tax, decrease GDP, that will decrease the spending on imports simply because people have less money to spend on imports. They're poorer, they can't afford as much stuff from China or food from Europe or wherever it might be. And there we go. That will decrease imports and reduce the deficit on the current account. That's a point. That's a measure that might be taken. We could get another one in here. In fact, we could get another 2 or 3, 5, 6, 7 different measures in here that just revolve around ADAS. So let's say we take a different route and we talk about increasing exports by increasing international competitiveness. So we could say instead the government could maybe reduce the minimum wage to lower costs of production. Deregulation, I like that actually. Deregulation to lower costs of production. Somebody, what's that going to do to aggregate supply? Deregulation to lower costs of production. Whilst I annotate. Niati, thank you again. Another direct message though, so it's not exactly what I want, but it is the right answer. Niati says aggregate supply will increase, shift to the right, correct, as costs of production fall. So there we go. And that will decrease the price level rule. So here I'm using the y-axis to help make my point instead of focusing on the x-axis. So I'm just going to change the color, draw that on for you guys. So that deregulation, decreased costs, shift supply to the right, decrease the price level in the economy, and that is going to make exports more competitive. So exports are now relatively cheaper compared to other countries, which means you can sell more exports, which means you can reduce the current account deficit. So that's two measures. That's potentially an essay ready to, well, not ready to go because you still need the evaluation of the AO2, but your key points could be ready to go just with ADAS knowledge, really, and being able to break down the question a bit, knowing what a deficit on the current account means. But it's if you see what I mean, you don't even really have to have studied the topic to get good analysis for this whole essay. Basically, what you really need to make it nice and easy is the high degree of comfort and confidence with aggregate demand and aggregate supply. And when you do the topic, you will find that there's more you can add. That you won't find that you replace what I've just told you with something else more complex. For example, you'll find that when you do this topic, you're basically learning exactly what I've just taught you, with some extra like terminology and definitions thrown in, like the difference between expenditure reduction policies and expenditure switching policies. You get some extra AO1 and things to put in the intro, for example, and hopefully go over some specific evaluations. But the core of the analysis will be the same. It will just be aggregate demand, aggregate supply. So hopefully you guys are really sort of seeing the importance of this in macro and the usefulness of it in macro. And take what I said at the start of the lesson seriously. You know, if you're not already, make this your primary objective to get as comfortable with this knowledge as possible. You know, all the facts in consumption, all the facts in investment. What are the reasons short on aggregate supply shifts? Start working on long aggregate supply. Time condition practice, 9 markers. You've got 13.5 minutes. If you take the ratio of minutes to marks, start practicing that now. Take the ones we've done today, June 17 paper. Great exercise for you guys after the lesson. Tell you what, if someone wants to do, let's say, a 9 marker and a 25 from today, I will mark the first one that gets emailed to me, only the first one, and I'll post feedback and marking for the class. So again, you'll have to be brave enough for that, but I'll make a deal with you guys. I'll mark the first one that gets sent to me, first come first serve. So 1, 9, 1, 25. Okay, June 17 paper, yeah? See how you do on this paper. So let's have a look for the last 15 minutes or so. We've already talked about direct and indirect taxes, so I think I'm going to leave question 14. Okay, let me look. This one, discuss the view that falling unemployment will inevitably lead to trade-offs with other macro policy objectives. So this is also quite a nice question, quite straightforward in terms of the way they teach the topics. I don't know if you guys will have covered it just yet, but once you've done objectives, you want to understand that one of the big ideas in macro is it's very difficult to achieve all the objectives at once, particularly if you consider the like sort of not core 4 objectives. So you've got a core 4, which is growth, employment, inflation control, and trade balance. I'm just going to put BOP, balance of payments, and then you kind of got your not core 4, just others. And I think the best way of thinking about it is like pretty much all governments in modern economics will think the first 4 are important. That's why they're kind of the core 4. There's very few people going to say, I want to shrink the economy instead of grow it. I want, like, no politician is going to run on a platform of making people poorer instead of richer, for example. But then these next 3 are maybe a bit more depends on the politician, depends on the political party. So you've got the environment, equality, and government finances. And it's very difficult to achieve all of these at once. In fact, achieving one often comes at the expense of another. So 25 markers on this idea are very common. And you just, oh, wait, not what I meant to do. Not what I meant to do. There we go. You just replace this with another objective. Discuss the view that increasing growth will inevitably lead to trade-offs. Discuss the view that controlling inflation will inevitably lead to trade-offs with other policy objectives. So this kind of 25 marker is very common, very straightforward, directly links to a massive topic, and they'll basically ask the same question in the simplest form. You can get like trickier wording and this kind of thing, but they'll just change the objective shown. So okay. How does ADAS do this then? Well, can someone again maybe put in the chat what would have to happen to aggregate demand for unemployment to fall? So falling unemployment, let's see if we can bring ADAS in through that. What would have to happen to aggregate demand for unemployment to fall for more people to have jobs? In the chat, please. Okay. We have Niati again, superstar of the lesson, but it's all direct message. It's all direct message. Okay. Niati says 80 would increase, correct. And hopefully, again, a lot of you are thinking in line with that, where if you've got more demand for things across the economy, whether that's consumption, investment, government spending, if you've got more demand for stuff, you're going to need more workers to make that stuff. Let's say consumers are demanding more houses and AD is going up. Well, you need people to build the houses, right? So demand for house builders goes up. Let's say it's firms doing the demand. They want to buy more capital and that's increasing AD. Well, you need workers to build the capital that the firms want to buy. Let's say it's government spending and government spending is driving aggregate demand upward. Well, you need builders to make the hospitals that the government is spending on, or the schools, or the roads, or whatever. So whoever is doing the demand, whatever reason AD is rising, it means someone in the economy or some group is buying more stuff. And if you want more stuff, you will need more workers to make that increased stuff. So we have very straightforwardly that falling unemployment is going to be, how should I express this, associated with AD increases. Not only, but this is just how I'm going to link it in here. So there is also aggregate supply causes of unemployment, and therefore aggregate supply causes of reduced unemployment. But I want to keep it simple, so we're just going to focus on AD increasing. Then the next question is, what macro objectives might trade off with this? And again, we want at least 2 points. Now I'm going to ask for answers in the chat. I'm very much getting the impression at this stage that wishing for a non-direct message is just wishful thinking. It's not going to happen. Maybe you need time, whatever, but direct message, whatever. I want you to explain the why here as well. So the question is, what objectives, we need 2 objectives this might trade off with. AD increasing, it will reduce unemployment, but what objective might that make worse? And I want a little explanation of why in the chat. Okay, so you've got 6 things you could link it to here. If employment rises because AD increases, what might get worse? What other objectives might get worse? And I think there's a good like 3, maybe 4 choices, maybe 3, 4, 3. Okay. I'll wait. So what might get worse? What objective might get worse? And briefly, why? Okay, I've got one response from Drew. He says this will conflict with low inflation as there's more demand. Niati, the same. Very good, dear BOP. Yes, so I was hoping someone would get Balance payments, well done, DSA. As these were all direct messages, I'm going to have to take you guys through some of the answers, which again just makes this less time efficient, but what can we do, right? So, exactly what I wanted. Dhruva said, and Niati said very similarly. This will conflict with low inflation, so it's going to prevent control of inflation. If AD increases, yes, that will reduce unemployment, but it's going to increase price level. We can show that with an ADAS diagram. There's a point. We're going to need a bit more meat on those bones, but that's a point. There we go. Niati has said demand exceeds supply, so inflation will increase. Yep, again, and that would be a nice way maybe of expanding the explanation a bit to talk about how effectively excess demand is created, and this is going to push up prices in the economy as a whole. So we've definitely got this strong link of inflation. Dia has got the one I really wanted though, because if you remember back to my lesson on ADAS, linking inflation and growth to the diagram is really, really easy. The trickier ones are unemployment and the balance of payments. So it's great to be able to link what's going on in the diagram to the balance of payments to trade. So in this case, Dia is saying that if aggregate demand rises and unemployment falls, this is going to increase income on the x-axis. Just ignore the non-linearity of that dotted line. So that's going to increase income from Y1 to Y2 on the x-axis. And with that increase in income, people will be able to buy more imports. So there we go. Very nice. People will buy more imports. That's going to make the balance of payments worse as there'll be more outflows relative to inflows. So, okay. Any question on that? Those two, let me know. Those, I think, are the two really nice ones we can do for points here. Another really easy one would be the environment. If there's more employment, reduced unemployment due to AD rising, that's going to mean more output, and more output is going to mean more pollution, more negative externalities of production, for example.